Pretty Story Manifestor, I'm so glad you're here. On this channel we give you writing pep talks, writing mindset and all things storytelling every Tuesday. I'm Leah Falls, writer, actor and empowerment coach, and today we'll be talking about the second part of the 10 ableist terms to delete from your manuscript. So if you haven't watched the first one yet, it's gonna be okay, but if you want to check it out first, I hope there's a link here. Anyway, let's jump in. Quick refresher in case you haven't watched the last video. Ableism is the conscious or subconscious discrimination and prejudice against mentally and physically disabled people. It's important to get educated about harmful language because it might promote the trivialization, ridicule, demonization, dehumanization and appropriation of disability terms and disabled people. I went over why this is important and why I don't think this is censorship in the last video, so if you're skeptical, I recommend you check that one out first. Especially if you want to argue with me, I just watch it first. But also, here's a lovely quote from the scholar and disability activist Rachel Cohen-Rottenberg, whose article I will be linking in the description. If a culture's language is full of pejorative metaphors about a group of people, that culture is not going to see those people as fully entitled to the same housing, employment, medical care, education, access, and inclusion as people in a more favored group. So language just very easily contributes to discrimination, and we don't want to further discrimination, so let's get educated about these terms. Also, we as writers especially actively influence culture, so it's very easy to become complicit in those very negative societal developments, and that's why I'm very passionate about getting educated about why certain terms are problematic and what stereotypes we might be subconsciously contributing to. Quick side note, I will be talking about some potentially triggering subjects. I will be using ableist language. That one I guess is obvious, but if you're worried about any triggers, please go in the description. I will be having the trigger warnings there. And I won't be going into anything graphic, and I'm trying to be very respectful about everything. But if you're very worried about a word potentially triggering you, please do check out the description beforehand. Wonderful. Number 1, spas or spastic. This term is often used as an insult to describe stupidity, physical inaptness, or any kind of weird behavior. I've heard this word in connection to bullying and insults a lot. Growing up, I knew a lot of guys who used it, and it is still in very common use despite being considered one of the most offensive terms to the disability community. And part of the issue is that the word can be used against a large group of very different disabilities, including mental ones as well. So it's not just directing harm towards one group, it is directing harm towards a lot of different groups. Medically, it was first used to describe cerebral palsy, and it comes from the Greek word spasticus to describe shaking uncontrollably. Spasticity, which is a disorder of the central nervous system, is one of 14 symptoms Mayo Clinic lists for cerebral palsy. So it's already not great to reduce cerebral palsy to this one symptom. But spasticity also occurs in multiple sclerosis, Parkinson, and epilepsy, to just name a few. The condition, it is a symptom of quite a lot of conditions. And outside of the specific physical disorder, the term is also used to describe any erratic or unusual movements a person might exhibit. This description could also fit stimming, aka self-stimulating regulatory behaviors, for example, hand flapping or fidgety movements, which are a big part of the ADHD and autistic communities. So what does that leave us with? The movements the term spas offensively describes are either involuntary behaviors or very important regulatory behaviors. So assigning low intelligence to them or using these behaviors as insults or jokes dehumanizes a large group of people that either, just do them involuntarily or really depend on them. It also makes those behaviors less acceptable in public, because when people see these and we use these terms as associations so often, it is what comes to mind. And spas is not a positive thing, so people immediately have negative reactions to seeing that kind of behavior, which is not something that we want to contribute to as writers, because It contributes to judging others, and judging others sucks. Judging others sucks. I don't have a poster, but I do believe in that. It's time to retire this term permanently. What to write instead? For movement, rash, unpredictable, forceful, erratic, or free-spirited if it's more in the stimming area. As an insult, asshole, wreck, bundle of nerves, egotist, or creep. Number 2. Do I smell a controversy? I think so. Crazy. The term crazy is just as debated as the term dumb, but I ask you to keep an open mind towards why it's problematic, at least for the next few minutes. We as a society very commonly use mental illness as an explanation for uncaring, daring, unreasonable, strange behaviors. And when we don't understand someone else's perspective, we very easily dismiss them as crazy. Collectively, we associate anything unpleasant with mental illness through words like that, and we use that to distance ourselves from those behaviors and from those perspectives. Because if we say that any unpleasant or uncomfortable behavior is a mental illness and we don't have that mental illness, we're off the hook. We can distance ourselves from it, and there's no self-reflection necessary. And isn't it always great when we don't have to reflect upon ourselves? It's not, it's just more comfortable. We scapegoat mental illness because it allows us to condemn people without seeing their humanity in us. Labeling a dictator as crazy is a lot easier than analyzing and investigating the socioeconomic, psychological, and cultural factors that made him that way. Because then, we have to learn a lot about how we live our lives and how we as a society live our lives. And just saying he's crazy, and we might be thinking of a person right now, it's just easier, but it's also not helpful. Labeling someone as crazy is also a very powerful tool to take away rights from a group of people that question the social norm. Each letter of the LGBTQ+ community has been or is currently considered a mental illness. And yes, people use that to take away access and medical care and a lot of other rights from them. And because we dehumanize people with mental illness and use derogatory language about them all the time, we never question if they should have their rights taken away in the first place. Historically, a label like crazy snatched away all the autonomy from a person and put them in horrifically abusive institutions, so it took a lot of rights away. And here's the issue. The way we use the term crazy to describe dangerous and harmful things justifies this past abuse and enables future one because we're continuing to strengthen the association. You're probably voluntarily watching a video about ableist language, so I don't think I have to tell you that we should respect people with mental illness. I ask you instead to consider what you're comparing it to when you say that something is crazy. Because crazy originally means mentally ill, so if you're applying it to anything, you're using it as a metaphor. Why? What's the association here? This is a really difficult one to drop from your vocabulary, trust me. I'm still working on it actually. But it's also a really impactful one. And once again, I said it a lot in my last video and I want to say it again here. There's no blame and there's no shame here for using it. We're conditioned to use these terms. But it's also a wonderful learning opportunity to see if we actually want to make those choices and actually want to continue using these terms despite the impact that it might have. What to use instead? Strange, bizarre, absurd, unreasonable, irrational, misguided, concerning, unpredictable. Number 3, midget. Unlike the other terms, this one isn't usually used as a pejorative towards able-bodied people. It's almost exclusively used for people with dwarfism, but unfortunately it is considered an okay description in a lot of circles when it is absolutely not. The word midget comes from midge, which describes a sandfly, and that association alone already shows that the word isn't okay, but the history associated with it makes it worse. First coined in 1816, the term was usually associated with freak shows and circuses, which were unfortunately oftentimes the only environment in which people with dwarfism and little people were able to find employment and be accepted in. Western society pushed little people to exist exclusively for entertainment purposes through a long history of fetishization and infantilization. And therefore they were confronted with a lot of barriers keeping them from creating regular lives and lives that were accessible to everyone else. not everyone else, a lot of other people. I can't go into the full history of little people here, obviously, but I will leave a very good article about it in the description, and I recommend you read it and continue your education. So knowing a little bit how the term was used historically, the point is the word midget is another, and unfortunately kind of the worst, of a list of offensive terms and stereotypes that were applied to little people that dehumanized them and made us look at this one characteristic about them instead of the whole person, and basically reduced them to what able-bodied people found entertaining. Once again, no judgment if you've used that term in the past for lack of knowledge, but yeah, it's an icky feeling knowing the truth about it. We need terminology that acknowledges the individuality and character of a person, so words that are associated with a painful history and offensive stereotypes just won't do. So please don't label your character a midget, even if it would be historically appropriate. Please don't do it. Little people or people with dwarfism is much more acceptable. And if you choose to write a character with dwarfism, more power to you. Researchers, especially own voices researchers, is very, very important. And I think in this case it would also be good to get a sensitivity reader. I do not cover this subject, but I'm sure there are a lot of resources out there. I will also link an article by Kate Brown. It's another wonderful resource, and her own personal experience of why the word is so harmful and hurtful to her. So I recommend you check out those two articles and educate yourself a little bit more. I did it and I greatly enjoyed is a really weird word here, but I very much love learning new things, especially about people. I do sure like to learn about the human species. They are sometimes very fascinating to me. Little person, person with dwarfism, person with achondroplasia. In terms of the word dwarf, that one is also very debated. Most people do not appreciate it, but there's some people in the community that do. Still, I would say avoid it. Tradition to make this a little less serious. We're learning is good. Number 4, a little OCD. I'm using this one as a stand-in for all mental illnesses that are used as adjectives to describe quirky traits or preferences, because that in general is an issue. I also hear it a lot with other mental illnesses, like she's a little bipolar, and it's never a good thing. So let's talk about why it's harmful. The two main issues here is that it spreads misinformation and that it trivializes the mental illness that it describes. So let's say your character is cleanly and likes to have things organized. Now, if you describe that character as a little OCD, you are saying that OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a preference. Sure, your character might function better when things are tidy, but do they feel a compulsive need to fulfill those requirements and suffer when they do not? Are they overwhelmed with terrible scenarios that might happen if they fail to comply with those requirements? No, they're just uncomfortable when things are untidy. And this is where the truth realization becomes really harmful, because it's not a matter of comfort, it's a matter of safety, and it's a matter of being capable of existing and functioning. And equating that to comfort trivializes it. Using any mental illness as an adjective to describe a characteristic also limits our cultural understanding of what that mental illness is to one stereotypical or one specific trait that is easy to recognize and easy to digest, unfortunately. We usually reduce it to the thing that is the most relatable, and that comes with its own kind of problems. Culturally reducing a mental illness to one characteristic not only makes it harder for people to receive the accommodations and considerations they require, it also keeps people that actually have the mental illness from seeking diagnosis because they might not fit that one characteristic. I'm gonna link another video on here by a fellow author tuber who talks about her OCD and how that influences her writing. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, go check it out. But let's take a very brief look at a few other symptoms of OCD that aren't fitting into the stereotypical view of it. When people use a little OCD, they mean organized, clean, and very particular about how they like to have a certain thing or how they like things to be. While some of that is similar to OCD, OCD is also having intrusive thought about harming someone else or yourself, compulsions like counting, and intense anxiety over uncertainty. And while there are different severity levels of OCD, describing someone as having a little OCD who does not is disrespectful for the people who do actually live with it. So what to write instead? Organized, particular, detail-oriented, meticulous, nitpicky, stickler, fastidious. I want to say here real quick, when I'm giving you the alternatives, I am using the negative connotations that we have with the word. I'm not using these adjectives to describe OCD. So please don't further those associations. I'm trying to use the associations that you have with the word and give you alternatives of what to actually use and what fits better. If those are not what you were considering, get that thesaurus out, grab that thesaurus, as if we all have like thesaurus on the shelf still. Although if you do, that's really cool. I want one. Getting off track. But definitely like search for your own words too. And don't think when I'm saying stickler, I'm describing OCD. I am not. Number 5, schizo. Similar to the last word, this term also spreads misinformation, but it's sort of worse because it's also used as an insult and as a very harmful thing. It's often used against people who portray one of the 2 most known symptoms of schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder, being hallucinations and delusions. But it's also used as a slur for people with multiple personalities, which has nothing to do with schizophrenia because it's called DID, or dissociative identity disorder. And those 2 are not related. I've also seen it used as an insult for people who rapidly switch moods, which is closer to bipolar disorder, but also, once again, it's an insult in a very negative short form of it. So it's not actually bipolar disorder, but if you're using it for rapidly changing moods, then it once again has nothing to do with schizophrenia. The confusion might come from the fact that doctors used to use schizophrenia as a blanket diagnosis for any mental illness that they didn't understand. For example, PTSD. So there were a lot of illnesses that were labeled schizophrenia until the 1970s and 80s. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of what schizophrenia actually is, but I'm also going to link 2 really great YouTube channels in the description, one about living with schizophrenia and one about living with DID, dissociative identity disorder. So definitely go check them out. Own voices is always wonderful on this subject. Schizophrenia consists of positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms, although positive here does not mean beneficial or not positive in general. Positive symptoms are the most widely known ones, which include but aren't limited to delusions, hallucinations, although having both auditory and visual hallucinations, especially at the same time, is, from what I understand, not that common. Also fabricated memories. Those are just a few of the positive symptoms. Then there's disorganized thinking and speech and disorganized motor behavior. Negative symptoms include depression, difficulty expressing emotions, and personal neglect. Violence, aggression, or lack of empathy are not inherently symptoms and characteristics of schizophrenia, and using the term schizo to describe those behaviors is very stigmatizing to one of the most stigmatized communities in the mental health world. When violence occurs, it's usually due to a lack of mental health care or support or understanding, and stigmatizing the mental illness and the people living with it further just increases the risk of that and just causes more problems. But even when violence occurs, it is much more likely that the aggression is turned towards self-harm than it is towards others. I didn't even want to add violence and aggression into this term, but when I looked up the term schizo, the first things that came up were slasher movies and horror books, and it was very disheartening because I did research on all of these terms, and this one, schizo, was the only one that almost exclusively brought up the negative stereotypes and what we're talking about, the problems are with the term, instead of talking about how it's a problem. So it's really important that we address it. Child abuse is a common risk factor for developing schizophrenia, and people with mental illness are sometimes more likely to be the victim of domestic abuse. So it is really cruel to center them only as the villains and to vilify their narratives when that's not the case in reality. And it is also, once again, enabling and sort of justifying abuse against them. What to write instead? The actual diagnosis, if it's schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, or DID, or bipolar disorder, and do a good chunk of research into it. And be prepared, I'm going to personally talk about this for a second here, be prepared that even though you do a lot of research, you're going to continue to learn. So even if you're trying to be really respectful in the first draft, you might get to the 8th draft and still realize that you made a mistake. Because that's what happened to me. Because in Goddess of Limbo, one of my main characters has schizoaffective disorder, and I'm still learning. And it's really important to still learn. So I think it's so important to include a vast range of diverse characters and tell their stories and include them into our stories, but be aware that this is not going to be a you get this right once and then you're good. It's a learning curve, and that's a good thing because it helps you grow as a person. So if you want to write about a person who has any of these conditions, never use the term schizo, and do research in the actual diagnosis. Now, if you're using it colloquially as an insult, here are a few other alternatives in what would be better to write. Creep, two-faced, danger, unpredictable, haywire, eccentric. Those are all 10 of the ableist terms I want you to be aware of. There's more, but I thought this would be a good start into the whole subject. And I talked about it in the last video, and I think it is really important that we embrace this as growth and as knowledge and not use it as a way to shame or guilt ourselves, because when we shame or guilt ourselves, we're way more likely to reject information instead of actually looking at it from a rational point of view and seeing what we can adapt and what we actually are against. So I very much encourage you to do that. If you haven't watched the first part of the video, I talk about this a little bit more there, and I would very much recommend you doing that. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Our website is storymanifestors.com. We offer writing services such as manuscript critiques, sensitivity reads, and a good chunk of other things as well. Go check that out. I'm not entirely sure if my social media is back up right now. I mentioned in the last video I got hacked and blocked and it's a mess. My social media accounts are going to be in the description, so if you want to check them out, hopefully they're back there. One of them is here, which is Forgotten Splinters on Instagram. That is the account for my book series and my epic fantasy series. But right now I'm kind of just fostering a fantasy community, and I'm posting memes that I think are funny, and maybe you do too, and interesting fantasy creatures, all that kind of stuff, so go check that out. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know which terms surprised you, what do you think of the whole crazy debate, and yeah, your general opinion about them. Also any questions, any of your thoughts on the research, I'd love to hear about that too. Let's continue talking about it. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. I don't know. Bye! Bye! I like that one. That one was snappy. I think I'm done here.